In the last session, we talked about a worldview that stems out of Darwinian evolution and the impact that it's had on society as a whole. There was another worldview that rose up around the same time. It starts in the 19th century, at least theoretically, and then it hits the 20th century with a major impact. And that particular worldview is based upon the writings of a man by the name of Karl Marx. Now, he's not alone in that, but Marx is the one we normally associate with this, and so we'll call this the Marxist worldview. Perhaps a little bit about Karl Marx to start off. Born in the area of Germany, what we now call Germany at least, and Marx was Jewish, and his whole family Jewish by ethnic background, but his father knew that by being Jewish, he's not really going to get ahead very much in society, so he took the family and he converted them to Lutheranism. Now this conversion, so to speak, was more just of an outward kind of thing, just to be able to move up the ladder and actually succeed in German society. But apparently this had a real effect upon Marx, as he did not like what his father had done. And there was a rebellion that was kind of bred within him from very, very early years. Even though he went to a church school and was taught all the particular doctrines, he ended up actually rejecting everything that was Christian. And when he developed his particular philosophy, it's a philosophy that has absolutely no real Christian input into it. And so when you combine the Darwinian approach with the Marxist approach, you have almost like a double-pronged kind of attack upon a biblical worldview. So the question then is, what did Marx actually believe? If you look at some of his writings, like the Communist Manifesto, which he did with Friedrich Engels, you'll see that really the bottom line here is that Marx views man as an economic entity, and therefore economic determinism is the reason for everything. In other words, economics kind of determines how everything plays out in history, and what we can see here is pretty much a materialist version of the world in which the spiritual really has very little impact. That's the way Marx looked at it. Now, there are people that Marx drew upon for his particular philosophy. It wasn't something he just kind of made up out of whole cloth. And so Marx does have individuals that we might call the sources of his thought. One of those individuals was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel is the man who gives us the whole concept of the dialectic. And to try to get to the end result of that, Hegel basically says that history is progress toward truly rational freedom. Hegel believed that when changes took place, those changes always made things better. For instance, he postulated there's a thesis, then there's an antithesis that comes against the thesis, and that will create a new synthesis, as he explained it. Now, probably the best way for me to try to communicate that is the thesis is like the way things are in society. The antithesis is something that comes along that challenges the way things are. It's going to be totally different from that. And as the two kind of combine together, a new way things are, in other words, the synthesis is created. As I think back on my own life, the best way to describe that is for someone who grew up in the 1960s is to look at the change that took place in American culture during that time. What we see prior to a revolution that took place in the 60s culturally is a belief that the American family with the father going off to work and having the house and the picket fence and the dogs and 2 kids, and that was the ideal. That was the way things were at that time. That was the thesis. And then things do come along to challenge that as time goes on. And we call it now the counterculture that hit pretty much in the mid-1960s and carried over beyond that. And as a result of that, what comes out of that is not a total change to the way things were, but we have a new synthesis, a new way things are. The businessmen who would have dressed up in their nice business suits with their crew-cut haircuts and all of that in the 1950s, by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, the hair is over the ears, the business suits might still be there, but they all might have pink ties or something like that. So we have changes that are not total change, but they are a change into a new way things are. Now, for Hegel, that means it's always going to be a step upward. For Hegel, God is kind of like just this mechanism that through this dialectic leads us into perfection ultimately. So history, as I said before, is progress toward truly rational freedom. The question here, though, is, does every change really denote progress? Or can it be something that actually goes in the wrong direction, going backwards? But for Hegel, it goes forwards all the time. There was another philosopher by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach. From Feuerbach, Marx took the idea of pure materialism, because Feuerbach basically says that man created the idea of God. And Marx really kind of latches onto that, considering his background and the rejection of the faith that his father tried to force the family into. So from Feuerbach's philosophy, what we see is that God is kind of like a crutch for man. Perhaps you have heard that particular statement before. Then there was a rabbi by the name of Moses Hess, and he believed that we had to have a classless society. Get rid of all the hierarchies and make everybody equal across the board. Now, when you take all three of these people and roll them all together, that's how we end up with Marxism. None of it really is all that original, although we are going to talk about his dialectic of history, which in my opinion is something he kind of just made up as he went along. It's something he thought was a possibility for how history developed, but he made it into basically an axiom. Just one comment from Hegel that might be kind of interesting. He said in the philosophy of history, all worth which the human being possesses, all spiritual reality, he possesses only through the state. Now again, that obviously has to have some kind of an influence on Karl Marx. What Marx created was something that we now call the historical dialectic. So he uses the term dialectic in the same way that Hegel did, but this is a historical dialectic from Marx's particular point of view. And in this dialectic, he has various stages of human history. Where he got some of these stages, especially at the beginning, is anybody's guess. But Marx starts off by saying that really mankind started off in primitive communal society. And in that primitive communal society, all property was shared in common. In effect, he's kind of saying this was almost like the ideal, the way the human race started. There was no government at that time. There was no religion. There was no philosophy. People weren't bothered by all of those things. So it looks for Marx to be almost like I said, the perfect society, but there was one thing in that society that made a difference that was kind of like what you might call the seed of destruction, and that was something called the family. Now, again, you might understand that's how Marx might look at it, considering what his father did with his family. Now, what happens here is that out of this primitive communal society, with the family as a means of destruction, we end up with a new society that's created that Marx then refers to as slave society. In slave society, what we see, it's now patterned after the family because we have the father who's the master in society, wife and children are slaves. That's what the relationship is all about as far as Marx is concerned. So we switch from the primitive communal society into this slave society. He also says it kind of gave birth then to things like private property. And when you have private property, some people are going to have more of it than others, and so therefore you have the creation of classes in society as well. And government is created to kind of rule over this. Religion is something that is drummed up out of this slave society, and philosophy too, the explanation of the reason of things, so that the people in government, the people who are the oppressors, can use religion and philosophy against everyone else who are now going to be termed the oppressed. Slave society gives birth later in history, he says, to feudal society, where the only real major change to take place is that the master-slave concept is transformed into lord-serf. The lord is the master of the manor, of the lands, and the serf works on the lands. The serf owes everything to him, and so he's basically kind of like a slave anyway, from Marx's point of view. Eventually, what happens, according to Marx, is capitalist society rises out of this. And in capitalist society, what we see is the lord-serf concept, that relationship, gets transformed into Marx's ideas of the capitalist and the worker. So the capitalist is kind of like the lord in the previous society. He's kind of like the master in the society before that, in the kinds of societies that Marx has created. And what about the workers? They're like the slaves. They're like the serfs. because Marx says the capitalists are the ones who own everything. The workers really own nothing. And as a result of all of this, there are going to be a number of capitalists that's going to diminish after a while because some are going to just kind of like rule over everybody else. They're going to capture the entire economy. So these capitalists will take over, but only the big capitalists will do so. And what's going to happen, according to Marx? There's going to be a massive increase in poverty. There's going to be greater exploitation of workers as a result of this. And we're going to see the working class eventually will arise and throw off all the capitalists because the oppressed are going to get rid of the oppressors. And when this happens, socialist society will emerge, where government now is going to be the source of all economic production and distribution. The reason for that is if you leave it to the private sector, there will be no fairness. It'll all just be all greed, and the people at the top will get everything, according to Marx. But the government will step in and be very altruistic, and it will impose fairness on everyone. We will make sure it's distributed the way it ought to be distributed, with a lot of faith there in government. A strong government is needed, he says, until finally all capitalist societies become extinct. There's going to be a kind of a battle between the remaining capitalist societies and the socialist societies that have been created, but the socialist societies will ultimately win. Remember, this is a Hegelian kind of concept. Every change moving forward is going to be a positive change from Marx's point of view. And what are we going to end up with? Ultimately, idealistically, according to Marx, is a communist society in which total equality finally is achieved. There's not going to be any government there. There's not going to be any philosophy now. There's not going to be any religion to oppress you. And the key to this also is there's no family now. It's not going to be built upon the family structure anymore. We're talking about total equality across the board. We don't have that kind of hierarchical situation. And from Marx's point of view, when we enter into communist society, perfection has been attained. Now, what's kind of interesting to me is we talk about, communism all the time, but if you really go by Marx's concept here of what communism ultimately is, where there's no government, no philosophy, no religion, no family, you look around the world and you can't really find any real communist society that's been set up. What we have are socialist societies, where government really is in control of all the means, production, distribution, and more or less culturally also, because you have to do whatever the government says. Will we ever get to communist society? Well, in Marx's imagination, yes, that's going to happen. But if you look in reality in the world, that really has never occurred. Now, Marx, as I said at the very beginning here, has a rejection of the Christian faith. Generally, overall, how does he view religion? Well, here's a few quotes from Karl Marx. First of all, he says, man makes religion. Religion does not make man. So, that's a starting point right there, where religion is something created by man. It's not something inherent. It's not something that comes from God, because there really is no God out there who has, imparted that kind of a truth to man. So he says, man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produces religion. Again, go back to his slave society where they said, we're creating religion now to kind of make sure that people are under our thumb, because there's going to be eternal punishments if you don't do what we say. So from Marx's point of view, that's the role of religion. He said the struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly, the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. He doesn't care for that particular world. He wants the materialist world to be the one that's going to dominate here. He also says religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. People want that because of it. And that's why he says a very famous comment that most people are at least vaguely aware of, where he says it is the opium of the people. And of course, opium, a drug, which will, make you kind of docile. It will make you obedient. You will then do whatever you're told to do. Okay? The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. The only way real happiness is going to come is by getting rid of religion, from the basis of understanding of Karl Marx. Okay? Now, Marx himself is not all that well known during his lifetime in the 19th century. No particular country follows Marxist principles, although some will become kind of socialist in some ways. It's the 20th century we have to look at to see, after Marx has died, and say, how did his ideas carry over into the 20th century? And there are so many, possibilities to look at here, because a good number of countries have bowed to the Marxist way of looking at things. But the two primary ones to look at would be the Soviet Union and Communist China. So let me just give you a little bit of an overview of that. About the creation of the USSR, we have Vladimir Lenin there on the left, and we have Joseph Stalin on the right. Under their leadership, first under Lenin, later under Stalin, what we see is the creation of a state that truly does try to carry out what Marx says about a socialist society, where it controls all manner of distribution and production and so forth. Now, it's never really efficient at doing so, but this is also a state in the Soviet Union that established what we call the modern practice of genocide. Because in the Soviet Union itself, classes of people need to be wiped out. If you just happen to be a certain type of person, you should not continue to exist. This starts under Lenin, and it carries forth after that under Stalin. We see, for instance, in 1932 and 1933, the Ukraine, which was the breadbasket of Europe, for some reason, 7 million people starved to death during that winter. Well, we call it the Ukrainian famine, but there's no mystery as to why this happens. The government, run by Stalin at that time, takes away the food from the Ukrainians because they are not obedient to him. They do not follow what he wants to have happen in the Ukraine. Therefore, he takes it away, 7 million starve. If you have never heard of this, there's a reason for that, because back during that time, nobody really reported on it. There was a New York Times journalist who was living in the Soviet Union at the time by the name of Walter Durante, who eventually got a Pulitzer Prize. But Walter Durante knew what was going on there, but he said nothing about it. He said everything is fine. And of course, if you look at the personal side of this, Durante was given a wonderful apartment by Stalin. He was given all the vodka he wanted. There was no reason for somebody that self-centered to want to say something that would upset his existence. 7 million people. Back in the 1980s, I guess it would have been 1983, I was contacted by someone who wanted to help publicize that 50 years before that, this Ukrainian famine actually took place. And so I contacted many people who were opinion leaders of that time, columnists and other individuals. And I kept trying to get them to say, can you write something about this so people are alerted to what actually happened? But in most cases, everybody just kind of said, no, we're not interested. We also see a great purge that took place from 1936 to 1938, where Stalin got rid of 1 million of his party faithful. He executed them in show trials. This is the face of what communism becomes, or the Marxist state. We can say the same thing about Communist China. Mao overthrows the nationalist government in 1949, and China becomes communist, the mainland at least. He introduces various policies like land reform in the early 1950s. He forced the redistribution of land. People who don't go along with it are executed, 1 to 3 million people. We had something in 1957 to 59 that he called the Great Leap Forward, which was an attempt to get rid of all free enterprise in China. And all that did was result in total economic collapse for the country. He was kind of pushed off to the side by other leaders in China after that, but he makes an attempt at a comeback in the 1960s with this Cultural Revolution. He's very upset about all Western influences in China, and they all need to be wiped out. There's a terror organization basically called the Red Guards that tries to enforce this upon all the Chinese people. This is, again, the face of a communist nation in the 20th century. And we could look at Cuba, we could look at North Korea, we could look at various other countries, all the Eastern Bloc countries the Soviet Union controlled in Europe, and we will see basically the same thing.